This video will be part 2 of Carl Rogers' Person-Centered Perspective, Chapter 11 for PSY 230 Personality Theory. In this part of the presentation, we're going to start off by talking about Carl Rogers' understanding of human motivation. He believed that all human beings are born with what he referred to as an actualizing tendency, or a self-actualizing tendency. You may remember from my discussion in part 1 how I said that Rogers believed that all people are born with the capacity for growth and for movement toward realizing some inherent set of potentials. And he referred to that with the term the self-actualizing tendency. He defined self-actualizing tendency as a drive toward expansion, toward greater complexity, toward extension. He, like most psychologists of his time period, did believe that growth meant movement toward independence. So he did see self as becoming more autonomous. He saw human beings as being designed to move in this growth-oriented pathway toward greater maturity. And for him, maturity meant, fully expressing who you are intended to be based on your inherent complement of attributes. His description of the self-actualizing tendency involved growth in the direction of expressing all of what you are capable of being. He believed that each individual was designed with inborn uniqueness and special capacities. So he really felt that we are designed to become more than what we may believe we are at the moment. And despite obstacles, we are still pushed in that direction of growth. So we're designed, once activated by the right environmental circumstances, we are designed to grow and become more and more of what we were intended to be. He described this as an inherent drive. Inherent meaning you're born with it. Drive referring to motivation. So we're inherently driven toward becoming as much as we possibly can be. And he really assumed that these inherent potentials, these inherent competencies or capabilities were biologically designed, that they were somehow written into our DNA as unique individuals. This drive toward health can't, though, necessarily overcome everything. There are obstacles, and growth can be interfered with by the environment and by circumstance, by things that happen. So our drive toward growth can be stalled. It can be twisted by things that we're experiencing, and it can be repressed. So there are certain points of agreement. It's not that Rogers didn't think that ego defense was possible, or that repression was possible. He certainly did believe that they were possible. But where he differed clearly with the psychoanalysts was the idea that we are more than just defense. For Freud, personality was a collection of defense processes. For Rogers, personality is defined in terms of our biologically inherent potentials. Our biologically determined uniqueness. And if those are not interfered with, and if the environment is growth promoting, we will become what we were supposed to become. Rogers also used this concept that he called personal power, which is it sounds very 60s, but he was writing earlier than that. But he talked about the fact that these inherent potentials, these things that we have that kind of are the thing that is waiting inside of you to be recognized and allowed to manifest itself, is actually quite powerful. So he suggests that, um, as your authors put it, just think about this statement from your chapter: who makes the decisions which consciously or unconsciously regulate or control thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of self or others? For Rogers, it's you. So you're the one who makes decisions consciously or unconsciously. You're the one in control of your thoughts and your feelings or your behaviors. Frequently, people feel disempowered when they feel like those things, decisions, thoughts, feelings, actions, when we feel like they are out of our own control. So part of what we're attempting to do is to rediscover our own personal power, to grow, to become more, to make our own decisions and choices, to regulate our own thinking and feeling. Personal power involves taking control of decision-making power. And part of what happens in therapy, in person-centered therapy, is empowering people to identify and understand their own thoughts and feelings, and then to take steps in the direction of manifesting their own decision-making power. Now, in some cases, personal power has to be subverted. There are many times, just in your everyday life, where you have to say, you know what, no, I'm not going to do that, because there are other things that need to be done first, or there are reasons for why, if I choose this particular action, it may have trickle-down effects on others. So we have these, what your authors describe as agreed-upon restrictions, where we agree to suppress our own personal power for the better of others, or in order to collaborate, in order to cooperate, to solve problems. And even in that acceptance of the need to collaborate and cooperate, there are growth-promoting opportunities. So in deciding, yes, I'm going to put aside my own personal desire to do X, Y, and Z so that I can collaborate and cooperate, that doesn't mean you're giving up, that you're losing. It means that you are actually choosing a path that involves engaging with others. So you are expressing your personal power by not moving in one direction, but instead moving in another. Rogers suggests that change in the nature of control, and in part he's going beyond the idea of personal growth and development to cultural and societal change. So he's taking this idea of personal power into the realm of becoming responsible for how to change organizations, how to change structures, whether they're social structures. You could look at it as, how do I change my business or my workplace or my school, or how do I change my country? People are able to enact change in those wider structures that surround them when they are in control of their own personal power. So he takes, in this part of the theory, he's really taking this idea of personal growth and development and then expanding it out beyond just the person, to making it manifest in a broader context. All right, now let's go back to how personality development occurs. And in order to understand personality development, you have to understand the concepts of congruence and incongruence, as they define really whether we're going to grow in a healthy way or whether we're going to grow in a maladaptive way. Congruence in Rogerian theory refers to the degree to which our experience of ourselves and the world, our ability to communicate our inner experiences, and our awareness of both self and the world the degree to which those things are consistent with one another. You can also talk about the degree to which the ideal image of self is consistent with the real self, but we'll wait for a second on that. To think about this idea of congruence. So communication refers to what you're expressing. So if you ask someone, tell me about yourself, and their answer to that question is, a series of statements about how the person sees themselves. How much does that statement, what the person says, match how you see them acting in the world, so what is occurring, and what is being noticed, what is being understood. So if you think about yourself, if I ask you, tell me about yourself, and you give me an answer, is that consistent with your own experience of what's happening in your world and how you behave in that world? So is that self that you've just described to me the same as the self that's actually engaging in experiences in the world? And are both of those two things, do they match the way you notice things in your world? Are they all the same? Not really, are they all the same? Are they all reflective of the same self? Incongruence refers to inconsistencies between these three facets. So if I ask you, tell me about yourself, and you give me an expression, and it's described in a way that is very different from how you see yourself in terms of your own experience and what you're aware of in your world, then what you are existing in is a state of incongruence. Rogers believed that when people aren't able to see themselves accurately, when they're either unable or unwilling to tell others who they really are, or both, it leads to a state of incongruence. For example, a person may say to others, I'm confident, I'm self-assured, I am capable of doing these things, and I'm happy. But in their own experience, they don't feel happy, they aren't comfortable, they aren't reflecting who they really are. And what they're noticing is that they don't like what they're doing, and what they're experiencing doesn't feel natural to them. To give you a even more concrete example, I had a student many, many years ago whose family really pressured all of the children in the family to go into the medical profession. So she began school here as a pre-med, very bright person, immediately started to struggle. When I talked to her about her experiences of her first 2 years in school, she talked about how at the time, when people would ask her, what are you doing? How's school? She would say, I'm on my path. I'm doing well in my classes. I'm happy because I'm making progress toward my goal of being a doctor. My parents are very pleased. But in her inner life, she found that she had to force herself to study. She wasn't inherently interested in any of the things she was studying. She had a really good time in some of her general education courses, but even though she was doing well in her classes, she did not enjoy the biology, she didn't enjoy the chemistry, and the thought of going into medicine and doing medical school was starting to make her anxious and fearful. So what she had was a state of incongruence between what she was saying when people asked her how school was going and how she was feeling about it, and what she was actually experiencing and noticing. She noticed that she was happier in other classes, especially religion classes, philosophy classes, and psychology classes, but she was unhappy and less motivated in her classes that were related to her pre-med program of study. So that's a concrete example of an experience of congruence versus incongruence. What this particular student found was that she was actually felt that studying both religion and psychology were more her calling. And as she shifted away from the pre-med field of study toward these other interests, she felt more congruent and was more happy. Another way to talk about this incongruence between awareness and experience, this is essentially the way in which Carl Rogers talked about ego defense. So this was essentially his replacement of concepts like repression and denial. When people are in a state of incongruence, like the student I was describing, when she would have conversations, she would often overstate the degree to which she was passionate about her pre-med course of study. That would be, being in a state of denial. It would also be intellectualizing and so on. So ego defenses are often an expression of an incongruent state psychologically. When we have these discrepancies between awareness and communication, so what you're aware of internally and what you're saying to yourself and what you're saying to others, there's a discrepancy. So you're essentially lying, whether you're lying to yourself or you're misrepresenting yourself to others. That creates dissatisfaction and unhappiness. When people express this kind of incongruence, it can be perceived by others as being basically dishonest if they notice it. Some people are quite good at covering and they don't show their discomfort or their unhappiness quite well, but others do not. So they may come off as being very surface, very inauthentic, and even outright deceitful in terms of the way they present themselves. But oftentimes their incongruency may be the most obvious in terms of their discomfort, their discontent, their unhappiness. Incongruence, therefore, it may show up in the form of being tense and anxious. It may show up in the form of being depressed. It can lead to feelings of confusion and stagnation, all kinds of ways of describing this unhappiness. For the student that I was describing earlier, she really was suffering in terms of feeling depressed, feeling anxious that her family would reject her. And in fact, there were tensions with her family when she announced that she was no longer going to be pre-med, that she was moving in the direction of studying both religion and psychology. They were disappointed. They were concerned for her future. There was some, bullying and pushing. But eventually she won them over because she was kind of a force of nature. But there was that. But after she made the decision, she said that her primary emotion was an overwhelming sense of relief and a sense that she no longer had to pretend to be someone she was not. Pretending with her advisor, pretending with her family, pretending with classmates, and so on. So what she experienced on moving in a more congruent direction was an overwhelming sense of relief. Again, I'm a visual learner, so I found this image is in some ways very helpful. Another way of thinking about congruent versus incongruent as concepts is the discrepancy between what people see as their ideal self. Remember back to part 1, Rogers talked about an ideal self, that ideally, in the healthiest version of ourselves, the ideal self overlaps a great deal with our self-image, still with some room for growth. So on the ideal side, this is what you want in terms of health. When the self-image, who you are right now, is overlapping quite a lot with who you would like to be, who you ideally want yourself to be. When there's more overlap, you feel authentic, you feel honest, you feel like who you're communicating yourself as is a good representation of who you actually are. And that means that you are capable of self-actualization. In an incongruent state, who you see yourself as, which would be your self-image, overlaps very little with your ideal self. So that that discrepancy means that you're going to spend a lot of time trying to bridge the gap between who you feel like you really are and what you think you should be. And under those circumstances, there's a great deal of tension. So you have to spend a great deal of time almost curating this ideal self. So back to the example of the student that I gave you, she felt like she was expending a great deal of her own personal energy trying to look like this ideal pre-med student, when in fact her real self-image was a person who was spiritually driven and very, very interested in the art of counseling, which, there were very inconsistent senses of self. So under those circumstances, this being able to grow, which Rogers calls self-actualization, is going to be really hard to do. Now, just to review a little bit, the humanistic perspective, that would be Rogers and also Maslow, emphasizes growth, free will, self-determination, personal awareness, all of those things. In contrast, your psychoanalytic perspective, Freud, Erikson, Jung, you have a real strong focus on childhood experiences, the unconscious, and the role of trauma in people's childhood as a driver of later experience. And there's also an attachment to the idea of impulse and drive hidden in the unconscious for those theorists. And they vary a little bit in terms of how much they're going to build in individual differences, but ultimately it goes down to that. Now, on the social cognitive side, you have a real emphasis on observational learning, watching, and then self-efficacy. And we saw that with Bandura. Now, some theories that we do not look at in this class are called trait points of view. They're often not included in traditional personality theory textbooks because they tend to be purely descriptive and don't involve a great deal of theorizing about structures or processes like motivation, but instead they're purely descriptive. So identifying traits and measuring those personality traits is core. So just to review, you have some clear differences between the way Rogers and Maslow as humanistic theories are approaching this idea of growth. People are inherently different. That's a commonality with the trait perspective. They do have a rich individual psychology that is consistent with psychoanalysis. They do learn from their environment, and self-efficacy is very important. The difference is, though, less importance of early childhood experiences and traumas, less emphasis on strictly describing, and less emphasis on strict learning theory for our humanists. Okay, so a little bit more about how Rogers defines psychological growth, or how he understands psychological growth. First, if you have positive forces, if you have a positive environment, then people are naturally going to move in the direction of growth. People are born with the capacity to experience incongruence as well as congruence. If you're going to move the person in the direction of healthy growth, what is best is for them to be moved in a direction that values congruence between self-concept and experience. But they do have the capacity to experience both congruence and incongruence. People, as a result of this capacity for perceiving incongruence, they can modify their self-concept to match what is expected of them. So if their world is highly demanding and says you must be this way, we have the capacity to modify how we involve ourselves in the world so that it fits with those expectations. Health is more likely in an environment where the person feels free to set aside that push toward incongruence. So they can work around or they can overcome pushes toward incongruent needs. So, for example, my student who felt pressured by her parents, by her culture, to move in this direction of becoming a medical professional, she felt at some point in her growth process that she needed to be allowed to grow in a different direction in order to be true to herself, to be authentic with herself. So at some point, she felt free enough from this incongruence to correct, to self-correct. And for Rogers, that's how growth occurs. Sometimes we need a little help. So let's say that, a person as an adult feels stuck, they feel anxious, they feel depressed. In therapy, what the therapist would try to do is to create a safe environment for that person to be able to explore what their inherent potentials are, what their natural tendencies are, to identify their state of incongruence, and then to move around it so that they can self-correct by choosing another path. Rogers felt that we have some basic biological needs that have to be met in order for us to grow in a healthy and positive way. So first, all human beings need what's called positive self-regard. You could define this loosely as self-esteem or self-worth. Basically, we need to feel satisfied with who we are. You could also call this self-acceptance. So Rogers believes that a necessary prerequisite for being able to grow and to accept others is basic self-acceptance. You probably heard the phrase, you can't love another person unless you love yourself. Rogers would agree with that. Yes, you have to have basic self-acceptance before you can move toward being able to be connected to other people. The second basic need is a basic need for positive regard from others. So you need to be valued by someone, anyone, ideally, people who matter. So significant others in your life, you need to feel accepted by them. We're in trouble when we are existing in an environment of lack of acceptance, of rejection, where you feel pressured to be something other than what you are. The last necessary element that Rogers felt was really critical was empathic understanding, which is being able to move in the direction of being able to empathically understand others. Now, part of positive regard, part of feeling the approval of others, part of feeling accepted is receiving empathic understanding. And then another need is to be able to express that to others. So Rogers is really stating here this reciprocal necessity. We both need to receive empathic understanding and we need to be able to give it to others in order to be fully developed. And that concludes part 2 of Carl Rogers' person-centered perspective.